had all the kids there and so forth, and then when the girl came into the room, everybody jumped out of darkness and they screamed in her face, "Surprise!" The girl was so frightened that she wet her pants. Oh, poor little girl. I felt terrible for her. And then, of course, there's another story that made it into the news, surprise party, where everybody's waiting behind the furniture and waiting for the guests to arrive. And when the door is opening, people get in their places, and then they jump out, and it turns out to be burglars coming into the house. It's a good thing they were there, right? They outnumbered the burglars. Most people don't like surprises, unless, of course, it's part of a surprise party. But most people, for the most part, like to control their lives in such a way where everything can be predicted. And it kind of makes sense. How can you plan a budget if you don't know what your income is going to be? And how can you plan your day if you don't know what's going to happen? And how can you just go about through a steady, stable life if you can at least control major aspects of it? And some people are actually pretty good at dealing with surprise and change, and they're very, very flexible, and some people not so much. But one thing that is acknowledged is that life is full of surprises because our God is a God of surprises. Just when you think you knew it all, or just when you think you had it all planned out, here comes the Spirit of God changing things up a little bit for you, or sometimes changing things up a lot. The story of Abraham and Sarah is a story full of surprise. Not only were they not expecting a child at their old age, but then all the surprises of things before that. And some of it was to their own making. Sarah, wanting to fix her situation with Abraham and no descendants, went ahead and got the surrogate mother, but little did she know that that would be an arrangement that just would not go well. Now, the stories of Abraham and Sarah actually reveal a God that comes into their lives and blesses them, and sometimes blesses them with more than what they expect. Blesses them in such a way that is beautiful to see. But it's also a God that requires from them a relationship. A God that is covenantal, and the covenant runs both ways. But there's more to the story of Abraham, especially when you look at it from the distance that we have. It's a distance of 4,000 years. Abraham, about 4,000 years ago, came down from an area in the Fertile Crescent that was populated by people whom we now call the Sumerians and the Amorites. And archaeologists and anthropologists have lots of information out there about the Sumerians and the Amorites and all the different warrior tribes of that era and that area. The Jewish people did not exist yet. So when we think of this land, which is now traditionally known as Israel and Palestine, the Jewish people were not there. It was populated by different warrior tribes that, for the most part, actually entirely, 100%, were polytheistic. They had multiple gods for all sorts of things. And fertility and being able to increase the size of the tribe was very important. So they had a lot of different fertility customs and a lot of different sacrifices that would go with it. One of the tribes, the Amorites, had a god by the name of Moloch, M-O-L-O-C-H. And Moloch was a god that demanded child sacrifice. And so when we read in the story of Abraham having to travel to the land of Moriah with his son and going to some mountain that God will let them know, that area was populated by the Amorites. And so when he goes ahead and to lay his son down to be sacrificed, that was within part of the dominant culture of the Amorites. And as barbaric as it seems to us now, it was actually pretty prevalent. Archaeologists have found different temple sites to the god Moloch with mass graves of children's bones under them. And so here we have Abraham, with all historical accounts of the Bible, going to sacrifice his son Isaac. And on the personal level, on the individual level, his change shows his faith. It demonstrates his ability to listen to God and to stop. And a man of faith, a man of great faith, who is the father of the great religions, the three world religions, at that moment made a decision, and that is to listen to the divine intervention and not sacrifice his son. Historically, it has another significance. It has a significance of the end of Moloch and the beginning of Yahweh. Yahweh began at that mountaintop. And Yahweh is the God of the Israelites, of the Jewish people, which then also became the God of Jesus. So one of the reasons we're focusing on these Old Testament stories is because these were the stories that formed the God view of Jesus. Jesus had a certain God view, and it was created by these stories. Now, the thing about them is that we see a character trait of God portrayed in these stories that runs throughout the entire Old Testament and then into the gospel stories and into the letters of Paul. And so it's important for us to go ahead and read these Old Testament stories and to analyze them and so forth, not only because of the historical significance it had on Jesus, but because it's also part of our own faith. The god Moloch was no longer to be seen, and a promise was made at that altar. And if you go back to the Bible and read it, it says that I will no longer ask you to sacrifice. So there is this covenant made between God and Abraham that not only benefits Abraham, but benefits their relationship. There's more to this story that needs to be seen. We focus a lot on Abraham, and traditionally speaking, a lot of Bibles and churches and pastors focus only on Abraham because Abraham and Isaac became the lineage for Judaism. But I want us to take a look at Hagar for a moment. And Hagar and her son Ishmael became the lineage for the religion of Islam. And Islam, for the most part, has claimed her and Ishmael as the beginning of their stories, of their scriptures. And this is where we overlap with them, because Hagar is still part of our stories. And there's something to be learned about Hagar here. There's something to be seen about her. She delivers what I consider to be the most beautiful line in the story. She says, "You are the God that sees me. You are the one who sees me." This is seen throughout the entire Old Testament and New Testament, a God who sees us, a God who hears our cries. Think about Exodus and the stories of Exodus. What is it that God says to Moses? "I have heard the cries of my people, and I remember my covenant with them." It's a covenant that goes all the way back to these stories of Abraham. But here, Hagar also has that. Notice that to Hagar, the same promise is made as it is to Abraham. And that is that Hagar will have descendants that will be too numerous to count. So God goes ahead and bestows upon Hagar the same faithful promise that she did to Abraham. And then Hagar responds, "You are the God that sees me." She was an Egyptian slave. And as a slave, she had no right, not even to her own body. And so if her master claimed her body, she had to give it. If her master claimed the son, then she had to give it. She had no rights whatsoever. We cannot overlook the fact that she was also Egyptian. In most of the Old Testament, you would be hard-pressed to find an Egyptian that is spoken of favorably. The Egyptians were the enemies. The Egyptians were the group of people who were the threat. And on top of that, they were also very wealthy. So as wealthy, powerful nation, they were a threat to the new nation of Israel. And as an Egyptian, when she was banished, we could see how many faithful Jewish readers of the story may have cheered, may have been happy. Oh, good, the Egyptian person is being banished. But yet God saw her. God saw her And she said, "You are the God that sees me." This speaks to the character of God. It is a character that is repeated throughout the Bible. God hears the cries of the suffering. But then Hagar did something that we need to take note of, and that is that she heard God's voice and she responded. Hagar actually perked up when God spoke to her, and she responded. And this is important to note because how many people do not pay attention to God? How many people ignore God's call? How many people do not acknowledge that the Spirit of God is knocking on their door? Sometimes God is trying to be heard, and we, God's people, don't listen. Now, the stories of Abraham and Sarah, Hagar and Ishmael are very, very old stories. And we might make the mistake to think that they no longer pertain to us because, after all, we are 21st century people and we have iPhones and iPads and life is so different. But there's some aspect of humanity that hasn't changed. Human nature still stays the same, regardless of how much changes around us. And there's that old idiom that no matter how much things change, they pretty much stay the same. And so consequently, our need to be in a relationship with God and God's call to be in a relationship with Him is still the constant. It's still the universal truth. And in the Old Testament, those stories of Abraham and Sarah, of Hagar and Ishmael, of Isaac, and all the stories that follow, are stories that we can still relate to. Here is a familiar story, a story that we all know in one form or the other. A husband and wife were estranged. The husband and wife were so upset at each other that the wife was kicked out of the house. Or maybe she just left and made threats that she would never return. And the wife went ahead and entered the desert of her life. It was a vulnerable time. She had to provide for herself and provide for her children. And she was cut off from the resources of her husband and her husband's family. Feeling all alone and abandoned, she cried out, and God heard her cry. God reached out and provided promises of a hopeful future, promises of a better life. How different is that from the stories of Hagar? Here's another familiar story. A man has a lucrative job. It pays so well, and it makes him such a powerful man that he holds on to that job. The downside to the job is that he must sacrifice his family time. He really doesn't have any time for his son, doesn't really have any time to be with the family. And so he's an absent father by all accounts. And he sacrificed his relationship with his son at the altar of money. And at a critical juncture in his son's life, God intervened and told him to stop. It's not worth it. All the money and all the power in the world is not worth sacrificing the relationship with your son. How different is this from the Abraham experience? My friends, our God is the God who sees us. And just as God saw Abraham at his best and at his worst, just as God saw Hagar at her best and at her worst, at their time of need and at their time of rejoicing, God sees us. And both Abraham and Hagar demonstrate a requirement that we could learn from. And that is a requirement that will reveal our character. That we must listen and we must respond. We must listen and pay attention. For in there, we will find the presence of God providing for us the hope for a better life, the hope for a promising future. Amen.